I'm thrilled to welcome Ruth Brimacombe to Gorringes. Ruth is a curator and art historian and has a particular interest in the Pre-Raphaelite movement and the Madox Brown sisters in particular. She curated an exhibition of Lucy and Catherine Madox Brown's works at the Watts Gallery in Surrey in autumn 2021, and she recently contributed a chapter on the sisters to a book about forgotten Pre-Raphaelite women, which comes out later this year. Ruth, a very warm welcome to Gorringes.
Thank you, I'm delighted to be here.
We're absolutely thrilled to have you, and you know about Aprés le Bal, you've written about it, but you've never seen it, I think.
That's true. So when you pull together an exhibition, you don't always get all the paintings that you want in the show, and sadly this one we weren't able to include, and so I've only ever seen it as a reproduction, and I'm really, really looking forward to seeing it in the flesh.
Let's go and take a look.
That would be wonderful.
So Ruth, set the scene for me a little bit. For those unfamiliar, what was the Pre-Raphaelite movement and what were its founding principles?
So the Pre-Raphaelite movement was quite a radical movement in mid-19th century. So in 1848, it was really, there were 6 or 7 artists involved, but there were 3 leading artists: Dante Gabriel Rossetti, John Everett Millais and Holman Hunt. And they set out to move against the conventions of the time, both sort of socially but also artistically. They were fed up with the academic orthodoxies of the Royal Academy, and so they wanted to go back to a form of art that was more about truth and sincerity. And so they looked, this is where the term comes from, Pre-Raphaelite, so back before Raphael, and they were looking for a more authentic way of painting again. But it was also about beauty, so they were very interested in beauty, and also truth to nature. This was so they were influenced by John Ruskin, and this was about observing details and painting it as you actually saw it, rather than more idealised stylistic formulas for painting, which they referred to Joshua Reynolds, who was the president of Royal Academy, as Sir Sloshua at that point. So they're very assertive and quite pugnacious. So they were the young British artists of their day, and they started by putting PRB onto signing their works with PRB, but not really explaining what it was. So it was one of those ways that they were really sort of getting under the skin of the establishment. And it's all about meticulous detail, painting onto a white ground, so you get these lovely luminous effects, very observational. So, for instance, with Millais, when he's painting the Christ Child in his father's carpentry studio, he's looking at, you can sense the curls of the paint and the flesh of the boy, that it's like an actual boy within an actual space, while still telling this religious story, this biblical story. And it was because it was moving against the conventions of the time, it was seen as being very radical and quite divisive. And that was sort of 1848. As they move on, by 1860, you get a sort of second wave of the Pre-Raphaelite movement, and that's with William Morris and Edward Burne-Jones. They come into the fold, and they start looking at medieval subjects, making it more lyrical. And this is where the movement moves into aestheticism and then on into symbolism. And that's more about creating a sense of feeling, a lyrical work about sensuous effects over kind of literal narratives.
And who was Lucy Madox Brown within the Pre-Raphaelites?
So Lucy Madox Brown was the eldest daughter of Ford Madox Brown. Now, to explain where he sits in sort of like the Pre-Raphaelite firmament, is he's never a formal member of the Pre-Raphaelite movement. He's slightly older, but they see him as a sort of a mentor. And when he talks to his family, he always says how he both influenced and was influenced by the Pre-Raphaelite movement. So he's regarded as an associate, and his best friend, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, asked to be trained by him and wants to work very closely with him, and he becomes a very close friend and is around his house all the time. Lucy is the first child of Madox Brown was married to his cousin, Elizabeth Bromley. It was quite an intellectual woman, and they travelled, and but very sadly, she died when Lucy was only 3.
Yeah.
And then he remarries his model, Emma Hill, and then he has 2 other children, Catherine Madox Brown and Oliver Madox Brown.
And would you characterise Lucy as an artist in her own right?
Oh, yes, very definitely. But it didn't happen straight away. So to begin with, she had quite an academic training.
Yeah.
He sent her to school to her mother's family. Helen Bromley had a school in Gravesend. So first of all, she went to school, and then she was tutored by the Rossetti family, by Francis Rossetti and Maria Rossetti. And so she had quite an academic training to begin with, while her sister actually chose to go into the studio when she was much younger, when she was 13, and to learn how to be an artist. And there's this story that is kind of part of Lucy's legend where in 1868, there is supposedly a crisis in the father's studio when one of the assistants wasn't able to help with the painting, and Lucy stepped forward and completed the painting. And from that moment, it was decided she was going to become formally trained as an artist and then to paint as a professional artist. And then from 1869, she starts exhibiting along with her brother and sister, who are also trained by Madox Brown, and they exhibit as the younger Madox Browns to begin with.
And presumably growing up as Ford Madox Brown's daughter, that really shaped who she was and afforded her opportunities that perhaps other people might not have had.
That's for sure. It gave her a platform, because at this time it was obviously quite hard for a woman artist to break into the professional world. Because she was part of Madox Brown's family, she already had, but it's sort of a double-edged sword. She had the advantages of being, identified with the Pre-Raphaelite movement and with his reputation. But it also meant that it possibly held her back as well, because it meant it was quite hard for her to be seen as an artist in her own right and as a creative individual in her own right. So I think there's always that kind of the duality of being the child of a well-known artist. But it was obviously, he was unusual in that he supported not just Lucy and Catherine, but there were other women in his workshop. So Marie Spartili Stillman was another artist who was being trained alongside them. Also the Epps sisters, Nellie and Laura Epps, and Laura marries Alma Tadema, who's another great figure from this time. So, he's actually quite ahead of his time in training female artists. So she was very fortunate to have that as a beginning.
And you've already touched on it, but her education as an artist, was that formal or informal?
So I think from 1868, she was trained more formally by him. I think there are studies that exist from before. So I think even though there's sort of, the story that goes with her biography, and when it's told by Ellen Clayton, does a piece about her as an artist, is very much this sudden 1868, her discovery of being artistic. But you can tell that there are studies from before that she will have been trying and sometimes copying her father's work, but just not in a very formal way. From 1868 it becomes formal, and then she's exhibiting professionally from 1869 up into 1875.
And do you think she saw herself as part of the Pre-Raphaelite circle or sort of peripheral to it? Where did she place herself, do you think?
Oh, I think she saw herself as being very central to it, because Madox Brown had this open house policy. Often, even when he didn't have, the money, when they sort of 1865, he becomes more successful, and they move to Fitzroy Square, and they are at the centre of Bohemian London, and they have lots of exciting thinkers and artists come around. But even before that, he has this sort of open door policy, and lots of artists and thinkers will have been invited to the house. And she will have seen herself as very much part of that. And then, of course, she ends up marrying William Michael Rossetti, who's Dante's brother. So, she's very, very integral to the Pre-Raphaelite scene.
And is she best understood as a Pre-Raphaelite artist or something more nuanced than that?
I think that she was beginning to develop out of her Pre-Raphaelite origins. And I think as this work is actually one of the key works that aligns her with the work of the aesthetic movements, which was that later development of Pre-Raphaelitism. And she's actually referred to by the critics of this work as a Swinburnian artist. And that is much more about creating these works with feeling. And I think there are sort of modernist elements to her work, which had she continued as an artist, you may well have seen that, you know, come much more to the fore.
Yeah.
And certainly when this work was exhibited at the turn of the century in 1901, there were some retrospectives around her father's paintings at that time, and her work and that of her sisters and brothers were included. And there's still very strong commentary about this work. And then at that point, you're moving into modernism. So it clearly resonates for people with more modernist interests. So I think you can see she's definitely sort of moving out of her father's shadow at that point.
Right. And that's a nice segue into talking a bit about the painting itself, Aprés le Bal. What do we know about it? How did it come about? Give us a little bit of the kind of background to it.
So Lucy's always looking for very erudite subject matter. She's always looking, often it's Shakespearean themes. In this case, it's Gautier, it's this French poem. He's like one part of the symbolist movement in France. And it's very typical of her to have chosen a literary subject as the theme for her work. It's a watercolour. So obviously the women at this time were generally expected to paint in watercolours. Lucy would actually push the boundaries with her next work, which was a Shakespearean theme, which was Ferdinand and Miranda from The Tempest, and that she paints in oil. So again, she's very progressive. She's quite bold.
Yeah.
So her first work as an artist was she painted a female artist painting in her studio, and that was the first work she made her debut with, which was quite a bold statement at the time. So Lucy's always sort of just poking at the establishment.
Getting a sense of her as a progressive person. She's painting a female artist in a studio. She's painting in oil instead of watercolour. This is someone who's pushing boundaries.
And her subject matter, women were encouraged to paint decorative, so flower paintings or domestic interiors. And of course, this is a domestic interior on one level, but actually it's got this extra intellectual and literary dimension to it, and that's quite typical of Lucy.
Yeah, and it was exhibited at the Dudley Gallery in, we think, 1870.
Yes.
And tell us a little bit about the Dudley Gallery and then the reaction to the painting itself.
So the Dudley Gallery is seen as a more experimental gallery. So they were much more open to having women artists and also other more progressive artists.
Yeah.
So Lucy's work was accepted she had one work accepted by the Royal Academy after this work, but often she didn't get accepted to be hung at the sort of within the mainstream salon. But she did get accepted by the Dudley Gallery, and her work, as I say, was associated with these other artists who were seen to be progressive and radical, like Simeon Solomon and Walter Crane, and Marie Spartley Stillman, who's obviously the other female artist who's working alongside her in her father's studio. And the reaction to this work, when you look at this work, because to us it just seems like a fairly innocuous domestic interior, it's just featuring two women. Yeah. But the reaction is really strong. So she gets some quite vitriolic reviews, which I'll just read you one of them just to show you just the strength of the reaction. So this was written by the Daily Telegraph and Courier's critic, and he writes, "But what are we to say of the monstrous and maniacal Aprés le Bal by Lucy Madox Brown? The story is simply that of a young lady who has been to a ball on the preceding night and apparently feels seedy the next morning. She is in white, her friend in black, and who looks like the living skeleton dipped in ink, sympathises with her and seemingly prescribes sal volatile. The epigraph to this morning tale is a sickly stanza from a poem by Théophile Gautier." So she's clearly hitting a nerve.
I don't think they liked it.
No, I mean, and obviously the Pre-Raphaelites had ruffled a lot of feathers because they were because if you paint in a different way, you're questioning societal norms. Lucy supported the suffrage movement. They pointed out their subject matter as Pre-Raphaelites would often be about the fallen woman and the plight of the fallen woman and the plight of the seamstress. Yeah. And so they were exposing, sort of some of society's underbelly and less glamorous subject matters, and that had obviously antagonised people. But it's hard to understand why this particular was seen as so divisive, and she is described as a Swinburnian artist. She says she's grouped together with these artists who are inspired by Algernon Swinburne, who is a poet, and again it's all about aestheticism and the creation of feeling. If you look at the work, they're dressed in aesthetic dress, which was much more loose form and flowing, and had sort of muted colours. Often they were sage, or here it's black and white, but quite a muted palette. And something about that, something about the work has really got under the skin of the critics, because she's sort of accused of affectation by another critic, and they're suggesting that these women would have been a laughingstock if they'd got, if they dressed like this at the ball.
Right.
And so there's a lot of antagonism towards it, which I think we struggle now to understand why it's so radical.
And what in painting the subject matter Aprés le Bal, why was that relevant? What was she seeking to convey?
So Aprés le Bal it comes from his La Comédie Humaine book, and it's about sort of like the smaller details of everyday sadness and the human condition.
Yeah.
And this is about, so after the women have been to the ball, it's the excitement and the glamour of the going to the ball and what you expect at the ball, and it's this sort of the beautiful sadness of the moment after.
Yeah.
That anticlimactic feel, the melancholic ennui that you feel. But it's just very interesting the way, as with the child in the carpenter's studio, it's the sense of that actual experience of what it felt like to be a woman coming back from the artifice and with all those societal expectations of what you were expected to do as women. And she's weary and dishevelled, it's the side that people are not used to seeing, and certainly not used to seeing painted.
Yeah. And how would you describe the emotional register of the painting?
I think melancholy, that's it's this, but it's sort of a sweet melancholy. It's sort of there's a beauty to the work, like you can see the beautiful sunrise happening in the window behind. The interior is beautiful. The way she's dressed, she's got flowers in her hair, in the bouquet. So it's a really attractive work, but it's this sweet sadness that kind of emits from the painting.
And what makes it a particularly sophisticated painting, in your opinion?
I think it's one of her most successful compositions. I think it really works when you stand in front of it. It sort of works compositionally. It feels balanced, and you're very focused on the face of the tired woman and the gesture between her and her. I'm assuming it's her sister or close friend who's sort of touching her on the shoulder and saying, it's time to go up. And I think it's psychologically it's very sophisticated. I think that's probably what sets it apart from some of her other works.
Yeah. And I mean, it's also interesting because as you look at it, there's so much going on in it. Actually, as we were just looking at it, there's bits of it that I hadn't noticed before. There's the view over the roofs, and then there's a pianoforte, and there's the Chinese vase.
The vases. So that's very much in keeping with this interest in the aesthetic interior, because obviously you also, like water crane becomes part of the arts and crafts movement, and William Morris is obviously very closely involved with this return to craft and beauty and creating beautiful things and creating beautiful interiors. So and she was strongly influenced by William Morris. So a contemporary of hers talked about how when they went to kind of soirees where they were present, how Lucy and Catherine would, go on about the teachings of William Morris. So she was definitely very influenced by William Morris as well. And you see that in this painting. So she's created the beautiful interior that the women are within. And
then we were talking earlier about this sort of like the painting giving us clues as to what happened at the ball. What have you picked up? What do you think is being conveyed?
Well, she's holding something in her hand, and I'm not sure if it's something, has the ball gone quite to plan? There's the flowers. It's not clear if the flowers are from her headdress or if someone has given her a little bouquet. Obviously, the formal bouquet is to the side, but there's just like little sort of hints at the evening before, and the excitement of the evening before, and the artifice of the evening before that kind of offsets this sort of like seeing her it's quite a vulnerable way to paint her. That you know, she's no longer wearing the kind of masks of social expectation.
And we've touched on the sort of, I mean, you've mentioned the reaction to the painting, which was, you know, pretty
extreme.
Yeah, and you know, maybe some of the reasons were the Pre-Raphaelite movement itself having ruffled feathers, the fact that a woman painted this. Is there, what else can you see in the composition? Like, what was Lucy trying to tell us? Is there some sort of additional context that we've spoken about, that she's a bit of a radical, she's always pushing boundaries? Was this painting pushing boundaries?
I think it's very much the female perspective. She's showing this experience, and she does through all her work. She always has very strong female protagonists, and so it's sort of pre-Raphaelitism, but through a female lens.
Yeah.
And she is sort of a proto-feminist. You know, she does go to the suffrage torts, and she does sign up with she's one of the first signatories to the suffrage movement. And you know, she is very political, very socialist, and very kind of politically aware, and quite radical in her thinking. When William Morris and her get married, they have it's not in a church. It's you know, they deliberately have a registry wedding.
Yeah.
So they're very kind of, they live as you know, their intellectual thinking. They're very committed to these causes.
Yeah.
And I think you see that in this work, that she's trying to convey what it's like to be a woman in this time, and so not presenting them as, you know, sort of conventional muses or models, or in the way that you'd expect to see a 19th century woman of that time, but actually give them a sense of their lived experience.
Yeah. And there are Aprés le Bal, or After the Ball, is a relatively, that there are other paintings sort of on that theme, most of them by men. How do the paintings by the men and this painting of the sort of same subject matter by a woman differ?
I think we had to look at some examples which are really beautiful, but they're quite theatrical, they're quite performative still. The woman is still presented in character. So often she's still very beautifully dressed. The expression is still quite sort of stylized. It's not an idealized. I think that's what's different with this work. It's not an idealized moment. It's more about, and this comes back to Pre-Raphaelite teaching, about painting contemporary life as it is,
right? Okay.
And the truth to nature, and that's what she's trying to do here.
So she's being a very true Pre-Raphaelite in this work, in some senses.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it was, I think she's being quite subversive, but in a very lyrical way. And I think that's why they react, because they're picking up on that sort of, that she's actually making the female protagonist and the female protagonist experience central to the art.
And just returning to the negative comments again, how do you think she would have reacted to those? Do you think in a way that she was almost provoking that kind of reaction, or?
Do you know, that's an interesting question. Whether or not she probably quite liked it in some ways to be. Her father always had a sense of being outside the mainstream establishment. So they're used to being bohemian and radical, and they have people who are, you know, causing waves in all different fields who are part of their circle. So I don't think she'd have minded particularly she's grouped in with Simeon Solomon and Walter Crane and these other people, Algernon Swinburne, who she knows and admires. So I think it was not necessarily an unpleasant experience for her. She's very, she wants to be taken seriously too. And if people are reacting to you like that, they're not, they are at least engaging with your ideas.
Yes.
And I think she probably quite appreciated that. She liked it when her Shakespearean work was complimented, and often she would take on Shakespearean subjects, which were regarded as, that's more the kind of the male artist preserve, but she would definitely enter into kind of creative dialogue with her father and also her brother, who would paint. Sometimes they paint different scenes from the same Shakespearean play.
Yeah. So
like she does Romeo and Juliet, which her father does a very famous piece from, and actually that's one of her most celebrated works. But she definitely wants to be taken seriously as an intellectual artist.
Yeah.
So I suspect actually that those reviews, one assumes that she was aware of them, but that she didn't necessarily see that as a negative point. It meant that she'd succeeded.
She was being spoken about.
She was being spoken about, she was being written about, and obviously having yourself reviewed was very important in terms of people buying your work.
Yeah.
So no, I think she was probably slightly, thrilled.
And just to sort of talk a bit more generally about women artists of the time and how Lucy sort of fit into that, we've touched on the fact that she probably had a slightly more fortunate position than others because she was the daughter of Ford Madox Brown, and that afforded her kind of opportunities that other people wouldn't had, both in terms of training and platform and being able to exhibit. Do you feel like sort of Lucy's been marginalised in art history, or were there other factors at play that may have kind of caused her not to be as famous as some of the male Pre-Raphaelites?
It is really interesting that given how central she was to the story and how close she was to the kind of key protagonists of Pre-Raphaelitism, that she is sort of consistently marginalised even in the retelling of Pre-Raphaelitism.
Okay.
And obviously in the past 30 years there's been a greater interest in female artists. But even so, it's only quite recently that her story has sort of been, and her sisters, because obviously they work very closely together as artist sisters, that there is more spotlight on her work. And I think certainly what I've written about is how the brother, they worked very closely in the workshop with her father and with the sister and the other, Mary Stillman, all exhibiting together, and you'd have like seasons, the exhibiting seasons, and you'd all have been working together on different themes. And then tragically, her brother dies of blood poisoning when he's only aged, I think it's 19. And Ford Madox Brown is absolutely devastated by the experience. And they all he sees Oliver as the lost genius. He had high hopes of him. He'd published a book. So early on, his art had been talked about, but then he was going to be this literary genius. And even though Madox Brown is very supportive of his daughter's creative endeavours and obviously enjoys having intellectual dialogues and conversations with her, he can't see her, it would appear, as the one who was going to take forward the Madox Brown name and bring the glory that he felt had sort of eluded him as an artist. And the Pre-Raphaelites all sort of circle around and support Madox Brown by kind of, helping to record Ollie as this lost genius.
Yeah.
And I think that the girls got sort of lost in the mix. And it just happened at the same point where they both got married relatively recently. So in 1874, Lucy has married William Michael Rossetti, and she has her first child in, I think it's 1875. And so I think it just coincides with a moment when, she's on this trajectory. She never intended to stop painting.
Yeah.
And women didn't always. So Marie Stillman got married, but carried on painting, produced sort of 50 works and continued to exhibit. But in this case, they sort of became subsumed by other sort of domestic cares. And I suspect that was partly, it was just because a coincidence, because it happened at the point when they'd lost and they were grieving this, the brother who they loved and worked with, and obviously the family. There was always like a shrine was kept to Nolly going forward. And then Madox Brown moves up to Manchester to paint the town hall murals. And I think just like those working dynamics are sort of broken.
Shifted, yeah.
And so she got sort of swept away and hasn't really, now there is more interest in her work. Partly though, a lot of the works are preserved in the family. They're in private hands, and they've been cherished in private hands and, are enjoyed, but privately. So because there's so few of these works, people haven't actually seen them, so they don't actually know that much about Lucy. More of Catherine Madox Brown's works have made it into public collections. Yeah. But because her works tended to be, they got a lot more critical commentary, but they didn't get purchased in the same way as Catherine's did. So actually, it's quite rare to see a work by Lucy.
Yeah, and it's sort of, I'm getting a sense then that there was sort of, that she had a visibility at the time, but that sort of that sort of faded over the decades and sort of as time has gone on. You mentioned that there's a bit more visibility over the last 20 to 30 years. What's changed, do you think?
Well, so there's been a lot of great scholarly work by people like Jan Marsh and Pamela Gerrish-Nunn were the first to kind of identify this group of individuals, these women, as having a significant part to play in Pre-Raphaelite history. And they've expanded, so I think what they're trying to show is that, yes, these male artists were doing great and pioneering things, but they weren't working in isolation.
Yes.
You know, there were women working alongside them,
Yeah.
sometimes helping support their work by, you know, providing sort of administration and business administration, or sourcing costumes for them, or sometimes they're models and they're muses. But for instance, like about Lizzie Siddal, who's the great love of Dante Gabriel Rossetti. So Glenda Yude is an art historian who has rediscovered how actually Lizzie Siddal was an important figure in her own right, was coming up, and may even, that some of the works we associate with the male Pre-Raphaelites, she may have even provided the kind of intellectual inspiration for those works. So that's why it's really important to bring them back into the story.
Yeah. And do you feel that Lucy Madox Brown deserves the place as sort of, you know, as central? We spoke about her regarding herself as having a central place in the Pre-Raphaelite movement. Do you think we're moving more towards her reclaiming that place, and is that deserved?
Yes, I think so, and I hope so, because it wasn't just that she was painted for this time, she also was the centre of this bohemian circle. She ran with William Michael Rossetti. They were important figures within that world, creating soirees and engagements between bringing different people together. She also wrote, she was the biographer, she was asked to write the biography of Mary Shelley, who was obviously another woman with high intellectual aspirations, who sometimes struggled with being a wife, and how that enabled her to, you know, to be creative, how she operate as the creative woman within the kind of the role of the wife. And so she was very important and central to that world. And also because you see this move towards modernism, I think that's another reason why she's quite an important figure to have back in the spotlight, because a lot of her works that were shown, so when they were shown later, Colour magazine, which is like this modernist magazine from the 1920s and 30s, talked about it's a view of, I think it's Charmworth, but it obviously has really strong modernist kind of hallmarks to it that people are picking up on. So even though it was short, what she did was really quite significant, and I think is part of the jigsaw puzzle that explains these developments.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk to us about Lucy and the Pre-Raphaelites and this work in particular. It's been fascinating to understand more about her and the painting. We're absolutely thrilled to be offering it in our upcoming Fine Art and Interiors sale. Thank you so much for coming and talking to us.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.